Jane, before we get on to superannuation, I just want to ask you, as a Victorian, your concerns about this latest outbreak. We've gone to 9 now, and it may well be a lot more, considering an infected person may well have been at the MCG. Do you feel like this also speeds up the need for the quarantine facility at Mickleham?
Well, most importantly, I think it speeds up the need for people to get themselves vaccinated. You know, we know that more vaccinations have occurred in Victoria than anywhere else. There's a good reason for that. I think there's an awful lot of Victorians that don't want to see a repeat of 2020. That was, quite a scarring experience for many Victorians. So I think that there'll be an awful lot of people that are booking their vaccinations today. There
has been another outbreak, though. It was at a hotel in South Australia, again back on the quarantine facility. Do you feel like there is now a bit more of a sense of urgency around a quarantine facility in Victoria?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister said it best. At the beginning of March last year, if you had have said that we could set up a hotel quarantine facility or a quarantine service that was 99.9% effective, everyone would have thought that he was over-promising. But in fact, that's exactly what hotel quarantine combined with the federal government's quarantine facilities. That's exactly what's been delivered. We always knew that there were going to be some breaches. That's why contact tracking and tracing is so important to get that right. But hotel quarantine has actually worked exceptionally well and brought hundreds of thousands of Australians back home.
Okay, now just on to superannuation, Jane. Some huge numbers have been released. So total super assets now stands at $3.1 trillion. It's quite a hefty sum.
Well, it's certainly not a cottage industry anymore. $3.1 trillion under management, around $30 billion a year is paid in fees. That's more than Australians pay in electricity bills and other power bills combined. So that's why it's so important that we pass the Your Future, Your Super legislation as soon as possible to make sure that this is an efficient system that's serving members rather than funds.
That's going to struggle to get through, though, isn't it? That's going to struggle to get through.
Your Future, Your Super legislation, no, we think that it will definitely pass, because I think people realise that the most important thing that we can do is make sure that your super fund follows you throughout your working life, that it's much easier to choose between funds, that funds are made accountable for their underperformance, and that there's a greater level of transparency and accountability by superannuation fund trustees. You know, these funds now are multi-billion-dollar companies, essentially, or trusts. They're bigger than a lot of companies on the ASX, and they should be held to the same level of accountability and transparency.
Craig Kelly and Bob Catter don't like parts of it, though. Have you had more conversations with them to try and change their minds, or are you going to press on without them?
Well, we've certainly had conversations with all of the crossbench, as we do with all superannuation legislation. You know, superannuation is a highly contested area, always has been. I don't think that we've passed a single superannuation bill in the last couple of years that hasn't been contested. But that said, it's also quite complicated, and it's important that we can speak to each of the crossbenchers and clarify their concerns. When we've done that already with some of them, and we'll continue to do that if they have continued concerns. But I have no doubt that we will pass these reforms, because it's so important to do so. You know, we want to make sure that your superannuation is working harder for members, harder for you. These are trusts. You know, they can't raise money on the ASX, they can't raise debt. The only money they've got to spend is your money. We want to make sure that they do so with the best financial interest of their members in mind.
The broad point of contention, though, Minister, is that directions power, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but it basically gives the government the power to veto any investment that's made by a super fund. Would you amend that? Because it seems like it's a dangerous precedent to set.
Well, actually, there are similar sorts of powers in all sorts of areas of legislation, but I think it's important to put it into context. You know, the best interest duty, we're expanding to make the best financial interest, that trustees have to consider the best financial interest of their members whenever they make an investment or an expenditure decision. And APRA have specifically said that there will be some grey areas. Even if you put the word financial in, there will be some grey areas. So, for instance, a board of trustees decides that an overseas junket is, an appropriate use of members' funds, or sponsoring a little league is an appropriate use of members' funds. Knowing that they can only spend members' money, that every dollar that they spend is somebody's retirement savings. Is that an appropriate area? We want to be able to have that very last resort power to say, no, that category of expenditure is inappropriate, or that category of investment is inappropriate, just to give APRA the enforcement power that it needs to make sure that every dollar is spent with members' interests in mind.
Okay, Jane Hume, we're going to have to wrap it up, but appreciate your time this morning. We'll talk to you soon.
It's a pleasure, Pete.